1947, a survey plane flew over the empty waste and simply stopped existing. It didn't crash. There was no fire, no debris field, no scream over the radio. It was there, flying steady at 8,000 feet, and then it was gone, plucked from the sky as cleanly as a thumb snuffs a candle. The search teams reached the perimeter 3 days later. Their watches stopped, their compasses spun, their radios filled with a static so loud it burst the speakers. They didn't find a wreck, they found a hole in the world. 40 years later, Wren stood at that same invisible line. The wind blew behind him, hot and relentless, but ahead, the air was still, dead still. He pulled out his compass. The needle wasn't spinning or searching for north. It was locked, pointing straight down at his boots, as if the earth itself had become the only pole that mattered. The sand ahead didn't drift. It waited. Wren took the first step into the silence. The moment his boot crossed the invisible perimeter, the world went mute. It wasn't a gradual fading of the wind or a distant call of a hawk. It was a violent amputation of sound. The air pressure dropped, sucking the noise right out of his ears, leaving only the wet, rhythmic thumping of his own pulse. Wren paused, adjusting the strap of his pack, waiting for his senses to recalibrate. They didn't. The silence here was heavy, a physical weight pressing against his eardrums, as if the atmosphere itself had solidified to hold a secret. He checked the GPS unit clipped to his shoulder. Dead. The screen wasn't broken. It was simply void of data, the satellites above unable to peer through the interference. He watched as the battery indicator, fully charged 10 minutes ago, ticked down before his eyes. 90%, 60, 20, 0. The screen faded to black. He pulled out the analog compass again. The needle had stopped its frantic spinning and was now locked tight, pointing straight down at his boots. That shouldn't be possible. Compasses follow magnetic north, not the center of the earth. Unless the center of the earth was suddenly very close. Wren knelt, scooping up a handful of sand. It didn't flow through his fingers like the silica dunes of the outer desert. It clumped, heavy and cold. He rubbed it between his gloves, feeling the grit bite into the leather. These weren't grains of rock. They were iron filings, billions of them, shaped by wind that hadn't blown in a century. He brushed the surface of the dune. The ripples weren't soft curves. They were rigid, jagged ridges, frozen in place by a magnetic field strong enough to stop a watch. The entire landscape was a held breath, a suspended animation of geology waiting for a signal to exhale. He moved forward, trudging through the heavy friction of the metallic ground. Every step required effort, the magnetism pulling at the eyelets of his boots, demanding he stay put. The dunes rose and fell like waves of a solidified ocean, sharp and grey under the relentless sun. In the trough of two massive iron hills, he saw it. It didn't look like a ruin. Ruins are messy, broken stone, eroded brick, the chaotic decay of things forgotten. This was precise. A perfect circle of oxidized green metal sat flush with the desert floor, perhaps 10 feet in diameter. Wren approached slowly. The rim was machined, a seamless ring of copper that had turned verdigris with age, but showed no sign of pitting or rust. He ran a gloved hand along the edge. It was cool, unnaturally so, absorbing the heat of the sun without warming up. The metal felt dense, ancient, and purposeful. This wasn't a well for water. It was an intake. The craftsmanship suggested industry, but the location suggested madness. Who builds a high-grade ventilation system in the middle of a geological dead zone? There were no rivets, no weld lines. It was as if the copper had been grown there, pushed up from the earth like a metallic flower. He unslung his pack and retrieved a flare. He didn't light it yet. He just held it over the black abyss of the opening. The air rising from the hole didn't smell like stagnant cave water. It smelled like ozone and old static, the scent of a thunderstorm trapped in a bottle for 80 years. He cracked the flare. The red light hissed into existence, the only sound in the vacuum. He dropped it. Ren counted. 1, 2, 3. The red light tumbled down, illuminating walls that were smooth, not rough-hewn rock. They were lined with the same green copper, spiraling down into the dark. 4, 5, 6. The flare didn't splash into water. It hit something solid with a dull, hollow clang that vibrated up through the soles of his boots. It wasn't the sound of stone. It was the sound of a lid on a very deep, very empty metal jar. And then the light went out. Not extinguished, but swallowed by the depth. Ren drove the anchor spike into the crest of the nearest dune. The magnetic field seized the steel and locked it into the earth with the strength of wet concrete. He tugged on the line. It was solid. In any other desert, anchoring a winch to a sand dune would be suicide. Here, the iron-heavy ground held the weight of a truck. He clipped the carabiner to his harness, checked the friction brake, and backed over the rim of the copper eye. The transition was immediate. The moment his head dipped below the level of the desert floor, the relentless sun vanished, replaced by a twilight gloom that smelled of old pennies and dry electricity. He fed the rope through the descender, lowering himself inch by inch into the throat of the anomaly. The walls were closer than they had looked from the surface. He was descending through a tube of seamless copper plating. The metal sheets curved to form a perfect cylinder. There were no rivets, no welding scars, no seams where one plate ended and another began. It was as if the entire shaft had been extruded from a single, massive ingot of copper, pushed up through the crust of the earth by a force that understood metallurgy better than geology. Ren kicked off the wall gently to stabilize his spin. His boot heel made no sound against the metal. He leaned in, clicking on his shoulder light to examine the surface as he passed. The copper wasn't smooth. It was etched with thousands of shallow, parallel grooves that spiraled downward in a tight helix. They weren't decorative. The precision of the spacing, the specific angle of the cut. It was aerodynamic riffing, designed to channel airflow with zero turbulence. This wasn't a mine shaft or a well. It was a high-velocity intake vent, engineered to pull massive volumes of air into the earth without creating a sonic signature. But as he passed the 50-foot mark, the environment shifted. By all laws of physics, the temperature should have dropped as he descended away from the sun-baked surface. Instead, the air growing around him was becoming heavy and warm. It wasn't the dry, suffocating heat of the desert above. It was a humid, oily warmth, like the exhaust from the back of an old refrigerator. Sweat pricked at his hairline. The smell of ozone grew stronger, stinging his nostrils with the sharp, chemical tang of a lightning strike that had just hit nearby. Ren paused his descent, hanging in the void, and pressed a gloved hand against the copper wall. It was vibrating. The movement was microscopic, too faint to see, but he could feel it in his fingertips, a low-frequency resonance that travelled up his arm and settled in his teeth. The metal was warm to the touch. Therefore, the system below wasn't dead. It was idling. The heat rising past him was waste energy, the thermal byproduct of a massive machine running on standby, venting its excess power slowly through the copper lining to avoid detection. The city wasn't just preserved, it was waiting. He continued down, the rope hissing through the break. At 80 feet, he passed a maintenance rung set into the wall. He slowed to look at it. It was a simple U-bar, likely for emergency ascents, but it caught his light in a way that made his stomach turn. The bar was silver, likely a titanium or chrome alloy, and it was spotless. There was no oxidation, no layer of dust, no spiderwebs spanning the gap between the bar and the wall. The red glow of the flare appeared below him, a dying ember in the dark. Ren let the rope play out faster, eager to be off the line. The shaft opened up at the bottom, the copper walls flaring outward into a wider space. His boots touched down, not on rock, but on a surface that clicked like polished stone. He unhooked the carabiner and knelt to examine the ground. It was a black, glass-like composite, sleek and seamless, absorbing the light of his headlamp rather than reflecting it. He stood up, the rope dangling beside him like a dead snake. Now that he was off the winch, the silence of the descent was broken. The vibration he had felt in the walls was audible here. It was a rhythmic, hydraulic thrumming deep in the architecture, like the heartbeat of a whale sleeping miles beneath the ocean. It was the sound of power, and it was getting louder. Ren unclipped the carabiner from his harness, the metallic snap echoing through the vastness of the space like a gunshot in a library. He let the rope fall, the line coiling onto the black glass floor, and turned to face the dark. He had expected a cave, or perhaps the rough-hewn walls of a mine. He had expected the claustrophobia of the underground. He didn't expect a cathedral. He was standing in a colossal atrium, a space so large that the beam of his headlamp failed to reach the ceiling. But he didn't need the lamp. The walls themselves provided the illumination. The geometric grooves he had seen in the shaft above continued here, fanning out across the architectural surfaces in complex, fractile patterns. They glowed with a faint, sickly phosphorescence, not the harsh buzz of electricity, but a low, chemical luminescence, like the bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures. The light was a pale, oxidizing green, casting long, sharp shadows that stretched across the polished floor. Ren took a step forward, his boots clicking sharply on the black composite. The sound was too loud. It travelled away from him, bouncing off distant walls, mapping the dimensions of a room that shouldn't exist. The architecture was brutalist and imposing, a celebration of weight and permanence. Massive pillars, thick as redwoods and shaped from a dark, matte metal, rose from the floor to vanish into the gloom above. They were designed to support the crushing weight of the entire desert, the millions of tons of iron-heavy sand that Ren had walked across only an hour ago. The scale was oppressive. It was built to make a human feel small, temporary, and soft. He stopped, tilting his head, listening to the silence that wasn't quite silence. The thrumming sound he had heard in the shaft was omnipresent here, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the floor itself. It felt less like a machine running and more like the idle purr of a massive, sleeping animal. But it was the air that stopped him. Ren took a deep breath, tasting the atmosphere. In a sealed subterranean chamber that had been cut off from the surface for decades, the air should have been dead. It should have smelled of dry rot, stagnant dust, and the slow decay of stone. It should have been heavy with carbon dioxide, but it wasn't. The air here was cold, crisp, and terrifyingly sterile. It tasted of recycled oxygen and a metallic tang, like the taste of a battery on the tongue. It was processed air. Ren ran a gloved finger along the side of the nearest pillar. He checked the fingertip. It was clean. There was no dust. In a desert environment, dust is an inevitability. It finds its way through the smallest cracks, settling in layers that mark the passage of time. To find a surface this deep underground without a single speck of silica meant only one thing. The ventilation system wasn't just a passive intake. It was an active, high-efficiency filtration loop that had been running without pause since the doors closed. The city was hermetically sealed, a perfect vacuum of preservation that kept the entropy of the world at bay. It was a museum case, keeping the contents pristine, waiting for an audience that never arrived. Ren moved toward the center of the atrium, where a semicircle of low, angular desks rose from the floor. They were control consoles, built from the same dark metal as the pillars. He approached the nearest station, wiping his light across the surface. There were no digital screens, no glass displays to shatter or fade. The interface was analog. Rows of heavy toggle switches, brass dials, and rolling drum counters. It was technology built to last 1,000 years, immune to software rot or data corruption. He leaned in close to one of the primary gauges. The face was etched with symbols he didn't recognize. Sharp, angular glyphs that looked more like mathematical notation than language. The needle on the gauge was resting near the bottom of the scale, in a zone marked with a heavy red line. But it wasn't still. Ren held his breath, watching the needle. It twitched. Every 4 seconds, in perfect sync with the hydraulic thrumming in the floor, the needle jumped a fraction of a millimeter to the right, then fell back. It was a heartbeat. The console wasn't dead. It was monitoring a system that was currently in a sleep cycle. The city wasn't abandoned. It was dormant. He looked up from the console, his eyes adjusting to the dim green light. The atrium wasn't just an entry hall. It was a sorting mechanism. To his left and right, massive blast doors were sealed shut, their locking mechanisms thick with grease that hadn't dried in a century. But directly ahead, past the ring of consoles, a single archway stood open. It led into a long, straight corridor that stretched into the darkness, lined with regularly spaced doorways. They looked like barracks, or perhaps cells. The layout was regimented, efficient, and cold. Ren felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. The system was keeping the air breathable, the lights on, and the pressure stable. It was spending an immense amount of energy to maintain a habitable environment. Ren checked the charge on his shoulder light, gripped the strap of his pack tighter, and walked away from the twitching needle. He stepped through the archway, leaving the vast, empty judgment of the atrium behind, and moved into the throat of the residential sector. The silence here felt different. It felt expectant. Ren moved deeper into the complex, his footsteps the only disruption in a silence that felt heavy enough to crush bone. The corridor stretched forward, like the spinal column of some great dormant beast, the vertebrae marked by the rhythmic spacing of the doors. The scale of the architecture implied a population of thousands. This wasn't a bunker for a chosen few, it was a habitat for a workforce. Yet, the emptiness was absolute. There was no hum of conversation, no distant clatter of machinery, no ghost of a footfall echoing from the levels above or below. The city was a tomb that had been scrubbed clean. He approached the first open doorway on his left. The door itself had slid into the wall, the mechanism flush and seamless, suggesting it hadn't been forced open, but had simply been left that way. Ren stepped across the threshold, swinging his light into the room. It was sparse, utilitarian, and terrifyingly tidy. A single cot was bolted to the wall, the mattress thin and covered in a grey, synthetic fabric that showed no signs of rot. A small desk was integrated into the bulkhead. A locker stood open, revealing a row of identical grey jumpsuits hanging like distinct, limp bodies. Ren moved to the desk. There, sitting on the metal surface, was a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. He leaned in close, careful not to touch them. They were folded neatly, placed beside a ceramic mug that still held a dark, crusted stain at the bottom, the evaporated residue of coffee or tea. He shone his light on the lenses. They were dusty, but beneath the film, the glass was intact. The owner hadn't fled. You don't leave your glasses behind if you're running for your life. You don't leave a half-finished drink if the alarms are blaring. The inhabitants hadn't left these rooms. They had been consumed where they stood, erased from the space so quickly that the coffee didn't even have time to spill. Ren backed out of the room, a cold sweat pricking at the back of his neck. He moved further down the hall, checking room after room. They were all the same. A journal left open to a mid-sentence scrawl, a boot left unlaced. The personal effects of 1,000 people, frozen in the last second of their existence. At the end of the corridor, the architecture opened up into a wider space, a supervisor's office, separated from the residential block by a wall of thick, reinforced glass. Ren pushed through the unlocked door. The air here was colder, the smell of ozone sharper. On the central desk, a massive logbook lay open. The pages weren't paper. They were thin sheets of a polymer that refused to yellow or decay. Ren scanned the columns of data. The language was technical, a mix of engineering shorthand and biological classification. He traced a line of text with his finger. Cycle 904. Harvest yield, nominal. Source, internal. He skipped down. Biomagnetic yield stabilizing. Grid demand increasing. The terms made his stomach turn. They weren't mining ore or drilling for oil. They were harvesting, and the source was internal. Under the logbook, tucked into a shelf, he found something else. A leather-bound field journal, cracked and dry-rotted. It didn't belong to the city. It belonged to the surface. Ren opened it carefully. The handwriting was frantic, the ink faded but legible. The date was from 1947. The writer described the same descent, the same silence, but the last entry was different. The handwriting had deteriorated into a jagged scrawl. "The lights are on, but no one is home," the entry read. "I was wrong. The city isn't abandoned. It feels hungry. It knows I am here. The walls, they are warming up." Ren looked up from the book. As if in response to the words, a sound echoed through the hall. A heavy, mechanical clank, like a bolt sliding home in a massive rifle. The faint green light in the copper veins of the walls suddenly pulsed, brightening to a sharp, arterial teal. The city had heard him. The pulse in the walls wasn't a warning. It was a digestion cycle starting. Ren watched as the arterial teal light raced along the copper conduits, moving faster than liquid, but slower than electricity. It was flowing toward a central point, converging on the heart of the complex with a singular, hungry purpose. The silence that had defined the city was gone now, replaced by a rising hum that vibrated the floor plates, a sound that started in the soles of his boots and worked its way up to the base of his skull. It was the sound of a massive turbine spinning up, shaking off the dust of decades to answer a dinner bell. Ren didn't run back to the surface. He couldn't. The logic of the explorer took over, the fatal need to see the thing that was making the noise. He followed the light. He moved out of the archive, back into the main corridor, and turned toward the center of the radial map he'd built in his head. The air was getting hotter by the second, the smell of ozone shifting into something sharper, metallic and bloody, like the taste of a split lip or the air after a high-voltage arc. He reached the end of the corridor. The blast doors that had been sealed in the atrium were open now, retracted into the walls to reveal the chamber beyond. Ren stepped onto the gantry and stopped, his hand gripping the cold rail. He was looking at the engine of necessity. It wasn't a reactor. There were no fuel rods, no containment pools, no steam turbines to turn heat into movement. It was a sphere, suspended in the center of a spherical room, held in place by nothing but magnetic tension. The sphere was massive, perhaps 50 feet across, and it was made of the same dark, glass-like composite as the floor, but wrapped in thousands of layers of bright, unoxidized copper wire. It looked like the armature of an electric motor, scaled up to the size of a cathedral dome. Surrounding it, lining the walls of the chamber, were the stators, huge, curved plates of iron and copper that focused the magnetic field inward. Ren gripped the railing of the gantry tighter as the metal vibrated against his gloves. He understood machines. He knew how power was generated in the world above. You burn something to boil water. Steam turns a turbine. The turbine spins a magnet inside a coil, and you get electricity. But this machine was missing the first half of the equation. There was no boiler. There was no intake for fuel. There was only the coil and the magnet. Therefore, the city wasn't generating power in the traditional sense. It was an induction motor. But an induction motor consumes energy to create motion. It doesn't create energy from nothing, unless the energy wasn't coming from the machine itself. Ren looked at the copper coils. They weren't glowing with output. They were glowing with intake. The flow of light he had seen in the hallway was feeding into the sphere, not coming out of it. The city was a parasite. It sat here, buried in the most magnetically active zone on the planet, acting as a massive tap into the Earth's own magnetic field. It was siphoning the static tension of the fault lines, drinking the energy that should have been shifting tectonic plates. But the Earth's field wasn't enough to wake it fully. The logbook had mentioned biomagnetic yields. The machine needed a catalyst. It needed a spark to bridge the gap between static potential and active current. It needed a conductor that was wet, salty, and alive. The realization hit Ren with the physical force of a blow. The copper well on the surface, the perfect, mysterious hole that defied the laws of the desert. It wasn't an entrance. It wasn't a ventilation shaft for a bunker. It was a lure. It was a shiny metal spinner on a fishing line, dropped into the ocean of the world above to catch the attention of the curious. It was designed to pull in the things that investigate anomalies, the planes, the survey teams, the solitary explorers with their compasses and their questions. The city didn't just survive on the Earth's field. It spiked its intake with the bioelectricity of the living. It was an engine that burned curiosity as fuel. The sphere in the center of the room began to rotate. It started slow, a lazy drift of the massive dark orb, but the air in the room instantly grew heavy. Ren felt his hair stand on end. His compass, still clipped to his belt, shattered, the glass face exploding outward as the needle tried to point at the sphere with enough force to bend the pin. But it wasn't just the metal on his belt that reacted. Ren felt a tug in his chest. It wasn't gravity. It was a sickening internal pull, as if his veins were suddenly filled with lead shot. He grabbed the railing, his knees buckling. The iron, the hemoglobin in his blood, the magnetic field was becoming so intense, it was interacting with the trace metals in his own biology. The machine wasn't just spinning, it was reaching out. Ren gasped as the invisible current seized him, the iron in his own blood tugging violently toward the center. The magnetic field didn't spike, it detonated. The air in the chamber snapped with the violence of a thunderclap, and the invisible hand of the machine slammed Ren against the gantry railing. The metal of the guardrail groaned under the impact, bowing outward over the abyss, the only thing keeping him from falling directly into the gravitational well of the spinning sphere. The wind roared, not from the movement of air, but from the displacement of force, tearing at his clothes and whipping the straps of his pack against his face. Ren tried to push back, to leverage himself off the railing, but he was paralyzed. The physics of the room had inverted. Down was no longer toward the floor, down was toward the sphere, and everything he carried was trying to fall. The steel D-rings on his harness, the multi-tool in his pocket, the spare batteries in his pack, they had all transformed from tools into anchors, each one pulling with the weight of a sledgehammer. The buckle of his belt dug into his abdomen, crushing the breath out of him as it tried to tear itself free and fly into the copper maw of the engine. He realized with a cold, sharp clarity that his equipment was going to kill him. He clawed at his waist, his fingers numb and heavy, fighting the resistance of the magnetic current. He managed to pop the clasp of his utility belt. It didn't drop to the floor. It flew. The heavy canvas belt, laden with his knife, his climbing gear, and his sample kits, ripped away from his body and shot horizontally across the room. It struck the spinning sphere with a spark of blue light and vanished, instantly pulverized by the friction of the copper coils. He shrugged out of his pack next, letting the straps slide off his shoulders. It was torn from his grip before he could even release it, hurtling into the machine like a moth into a turbine. But as the weight left him, the pressure didn't lift. Ren was still pinned to the railing, his body heavy, his limbs moving through the air as if it were cooling tar. But the pull wasn't just physical, it was internal. As he hung there, gasping for air in the ozone-thick wind, he felt a lethargy washing over him that had nothing to do with adrenaline or fatigue. It was a grey, static fuzz, creating a barrier between his will and his muscles. His vision began to tunnel, the edges blurring into a soft, vibrating static. He tried to think of his next move, but the thought slipped away, dissolving before he could grasp it. His neural synapses were firing slower. The electrical signals that told his heart to beat and his lungs to expand were being dampened, siphoned off by the field. Therefore, the danger wasn't just being crushed, it was being extinguished. He was a battery, and the city was draining him dry. He had minutes, perhaps seconds before his heart simply forgot to beat, its electrical rhythm overridden by the stronger pulse of the machine. The survival counter wasn't on a dial, it was the fading thump in his own chest. Ren forced his legs to move. He dropped to the floor, crawling beneath the intense magnetic shear of the standing height. The floor plates were vibrating so violently his teeth rattled in his skull. He clawed at the black glass composite, dragging himself inch by agonizing inch back toward the corridor. The invisible current pulled at his boots, at the iron eyelets, at the blood in his veins, trying to drag him back to the edge. The city's voice rose to a deafening crescendo. It wasn't a mechanical sound anymore. It was a low-frequency resonance that bypassed his ears and vibrated directly in the fluid of his inner ear and the marrow of his bones. It was a hunger pang, broadcast at 100 decibels. It blurred his vision, shaking the world into a double image of teal light in copper shadows. He saw the blast doors to the engine room beginning to slide shut. The massive slabs of metal were fighting the magnetic current, grinding slowly on their tracks, sealing the chamber to contain the reaction. If he was on the wrong side when they met, he would be fuel. Ren lunged forward, his movement clumsy and desperate. He didn't make it to the main archway. The doors were closing too fast. But 5 feet to his right, near the floor, a maintenance hatch had popped open, the pressure differential blowing the cover off. It was a dark, narrow service chute, shielded by heavy lead lining. He didn't think. He rolled. He threw his body sideways, letting the momentum carry him across the slick floor. He hit the opening shoulder first, jamming himself into the tight metal square just as the main blast doors slammed together with a sound like the end of the world. The seal was airtight. The roar of the machine was instantly muffled, cut off as if a switch had been thrown. Ren tumbled into the dark, sliding down a steep, smooth ramp into the silence of the walls. Ren hit the bottom of the chute hard, his boots skidding on the metal grating of the service tunnel. He didn't stop moving. He scrambled to his feet, putting his back against the cool, lead-lined wall, his chest heaving as he waited for the blast doors above to buckle or the floor to open up. But nothing happened. The tunnel held. The lead shielding in the walls was thick enough to dampen the magnetic field, leaving only a faint, static prickle on his skin, like the air before a snowstorm. The roar of the engine room was reduced to a dull, vibrating throb that resonated in the marrow of his bones, a constant reminder of the monster spinning just a few feet away. But while the magnetic pull was weaker here, The heat was intense. The tunnel ran parallel to the engine chamber, acting as a crawl space between the inner workings of the machine and the outer shell of the city. The wall to his left was radiating warmth, the air shimmering in the beam of his shoulder light. It smelled of baking metal and dry, ancient dust, the smell of an oven that hasn't been cleaned in years. Ren wiped the sweat from his eyes and turned his light down the narrow passage. It was a maintenance artery, cluttered with pipes and conduits that ran along the ceiling like the intestines of a mechanical giant. He began to crawl, keeping his head low to avoid the scalding pipes. The tunnel was tight, designed for something smaller than a human, or perhaps something that didn't mind the heat. He moved with a grim determination, checking the schematics etched into the occasional wall panel. He was looking for a vertical access shaft, a way to bypass the sealed atrium and reach the surface intake. 50 feet down the tunnel, the path was blocked. Ren stopped, his light playing over the obstruction. At first he thought it was a bundle of insulation that had fallen from the ceiling, a heap of tattered, dark fabric slumped against the piping. Then he saw the boot. It was leather, cracked and curled with age, the laces rotted away. He crawled closer, the dread in his stomach turning into a cold, hard knot. It was the explorer, the author of the journal. He had made it this far, perhaps escaping the same room Ren had just fled, crawling into this hole to die in the dark. But as Ren leaned in, he realized the man hadn't just died of dehydration or injury. The body was fused to the wall. The explorer was sitting upright, his back pressed against a cluster of heavy copper conduits. But the metal hadn't just heated up behind him. It had grown. Thin, vein-like tendrils of copper had sprouted from the main pipe, piercing the leather of the flight jacket, weaving through the fabric of the trousers and embedding themselves into the dried flesh beneath. The man's face was a husk, the skin pulled tight over the skull, turning the color of old parchment. There was no sign of rot. There were no insects. The body was perfectly preserved, mummified in the dry heat. Ren stared at the connection points. The copper tendrils entered the body at the neck, the wrists, and the femoral arteries, surgical, precise, preserving the shell while draining the spark within. This was the fate of the fuel. A spent battery, discarded in the service crawlspace after it could no longer hold a charge. He looked away, the image burning into his retinas. The legends of the glass gate, whispered among the desert nomads, suddenly made sense. They spoke of a portal that took men to the underworld, leaving no trace behind. They were wrong. The gate didn't take you anywhere. It kept you. It filed you away in the dark, using the heat of your own life to keep the lights on for another cycle. Ren forced himself to move past the body. He couldn't help him. The man had been dead since 1947. He squeezed through the gap between the mummified legs and the hot wall, trying not to touch the copper veins that had claimed the explorer. 10 yards past the body, the tunnel ended at a vertical ladder and a heavy manual control terminal. Ren checked the markings. This was the override for the intake iris, the copper well he had descended through. He grabbed the wheel of the valve and pulled. It didn't budge. The hydraulic lines were depressurized, the locking mechanism engaged by the system's startup sequence. He looked at the panel next to the wheel. It was dead, the power rerouted to the engine. To open the door, he needed to trick the solenoid into releasing the lock. He needed a surge. Ren unslung his pack, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the heat exhaustion setting in. He pulled out his 2 spare heavy-duty battery bricks, the ones used for the winch motor. They held enough charge to jump-start a truck. He stripped the insulation from the leads with his teeth, spitting the plastic onto the floor. He had a choice. If he bridged the connection to the solenoid, the surge might pop the lock and open the iris above. But it would also dump every ounce of stored power he had left. If the door didn't open, or if the ladder shaft was blocked, he would be trapped in the dark with no light, no winch, and a city that was waking up to feed. He looked back down the tunnel, toward the shadow of the dead man. That was the alternative, to become a permanent fixture of the plumbing. Ren jammed the wires into the terminal ports. "Not today," he whispered to the silence. He touched the positive and negative leads together. The spark wasn't a snap. It was a detonation of white light. The batteries died instantly, dumping their entire chemical load into the override circuit in a single microsecond. The terminal screamed, a high-pitched electronic shriek of overloaded capacitors exploding behind the panel. Ren threw his arm over his face as a shower of sparks rained down, smelling of ozone and fried copper. For a heartbeat, the silence returned, absolute and terrifying. Then, the system convulsed. The heavy manual wheel spun on its own, driven by a phantom surge of power, and the hydraulic lock on the vertical shaft disengaged with a sound like a cannon shot. The hatch swung open. But the city didn't give up its secrets for free. The energy Ren had forced into the system had nowhere to go. It couldn't feed the engine, so it dumped into the structure as thermal waste. The copper veins in the walls, previously glowing with that sickly arterial teal, suddenly flared white-hot. The temperature in the tunnel spiked 40 degrees in a second. The air shimmered, warping the light, turning the service crawl space into a convection oven. Ren didn't wait for the heat to cook him. He lunged for the opening, grabbing the bottom rung of the ladder. The metal was already warm, vibrating with the chaotic energy of the short circuit. He hauled himself into the shaft, looking up toward the surface, desperate for the sight of the sky. He saw it. A circle of perfect pale blue, 200 feet above. But the victory turned to ash in his mouth. The circle was moving. The copper rim at the surface wasn't static. It was an iris mechanism, a massive mechanical shutter designed to seal the intake in the event of a system failure. And it was rotating shut. The circle was shrinking, the blades of the iris grinding together with the slow, unstoppable torque of a tectonic plate. Ren began to climb. It wasn't a rhythmic ascent. It was a frantic scramble against gravity and thermodynamics. The first 20 feet were a blur of adrenaline, his boots clanging against the rungs, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. But as he rose, the environment turned hostile. The shaft was acting as a chimney. The heat rising from the overloaded engine room below was drafting up past him, carrying the stench of ozone and the acrid black smoke of melting insulation. He was climbing inside an exhaust pipe. The rungs were searing. Through the thick leather of his gloves, he could feel the metal biting into his palms, a radiant heat that threatened to blister the skin if he held on for more than a second. Each grip became a calculated transaction of pain. Grab, pull, release, repeat. He couldn't stop. To stop was to burn. But the heat wasn't the only enemy. The city knew he was leaving. The low, hunger pang thrumming he had heard in the atrium shifted. It rose in pitch, becoming a discordant, grinding screech of metal on metal. It was the sound of the mechanism fighting its own safety protocols, trying to snatch him back before the seal closed. The magnetic field, though dampened by the distance from the core, still clawed at him. It wasn't just gravity pulling him down. It was the iron in the eyelets of his boots, the zipper on his jacket, the very hemoglobin in his blood. Ren felt heavy, sluggish, as if he were climbing through molasses. The invisible current tugged at his limbs, demanding he let go, demanding he fall back into the cool, dark throat of the machine. He gritted his teeth, tasting copper and sweat. He forced his legs to piston up and down, fighting the lethargy that tried to blur his vision. 100 feet. The rubber soles of his boots were softening, leaving black, tacky smears on the hot metal rungs. The smell of burning rubber joined the cacophony of odors. He didn't look down. Looking down meant seeing the dark abyss waiting to catch him. He focused entirely on the light above. The circle of blue was half the size it had been. The iris was grinding shut, the massive copper blades sliding together like the shutter of a camera. The sky was no longer a window. It was a slit, a narrowing opportunity that was vanishing by the second. 70 feet. The heat was blistering now. His skin felt tight, dried out by the superheated air rushing past him. His vision was swimming, the edges greying out as the oxygen thinned in the rising column of thermal waste. He gasped, his throat raw, his lungs burning with every inhalation. The sound of the closing iris was louder than the city now, a deep, geological grinding of gears the size of houses, a sound that vibrated the ladder in his hands. Ren reached the final section. The opening was now barely wide enough for his shoulders. He could see the sand at the edge of the rim, vibrating from the force of the closing mechanism. The sunlight was blinding, a sharp contrast to the gloom of the shaft. He didn't have time to be careful. He didn't have time to check his grip or time his jump. The iris was seconds away from sealing the world away forever. He locked his eyes on the shrinking triangle of blue. The city screamed below him, a final, frustrated roar of a predator denied its meal. Ren ignored it. He coiled his muscles, ignoring the pain in his burned hands, and threw himself upward. Ren threw himself through the gap, just as the teeth of the mechanism met. The copper blades sheared the air inches below his boots, snapping shut with a force that sent a shockwave through the dune. He didn't land gracefully. He hit the hot, magnetized sand with the momentum of a crash test, rolling hard to shed the velocity, his jacket tearing against the rigid, iron-heavy ripples of the ground. He scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the rim, his breath tearing at his throat. The ground beneath him shuddered, a deep, subterranean groan that vibrated through his spine. It was the sound of a vault door closing on the apocalypse. The iris had sealed. Where there had been a gaping, heat-spewing throat a moment ago, there was now only a flat, seamless disc of green copper, flush with the desert floor. The join was perfect. If you didn't know what to look for, you would think it was just a strange discoloration in the rock, a trick of the light and the heat haze. But the silence didn't return immediately. For a long, terrifying minute, the desert hummed. The sand around the copper rim began to dance, vibrating in complex geometric patterns, somatics driven by the immense magnetic frustration of the machine below. The city was still awake. It was still hungry. It had sensed the bioelectric spark of a living thing, tasted the iron in the blood, and had been denied its meal at the last second. The vibration was a growl. It was the sound of a predator pacing behind a fence, waiting for the lock to fail or the prey to return. Ren lay there until the tremors faded, watching the patterns in the sand collapse back into stillness. The heat radiating from the copper slowly dissipated, absorbed by the infinite patience of the desert. The silence, when it finally settled, was heavier than before. It wasn't just the absence of sound anymore, it was the presence of a secret. The empty waste wasn't empty, it was a roof. It was the camouflage over a starving mouth that had been waiting 80 years to eat. He sat up, his muscles trembling as the adrenaline crash hit him. He reached for his belt to check his gear. The GPS was gone, lost in the slide. His flashlight was dead. He pulled out the analog compass, the tool that had started this entire descent. It was destroyed. The glass face was gone, exploded outward by the pressure. The needle wasn't just stuck. It was fused to the casing, melted into a twisted lump of steel that pointed relentlessly, unyieldingly, straight down. It wasn't pointing north. It was pointing at the engine. It was pointing at the sphere that was still spinning, miles below his boots, waiting for the next magnetic anomaly to wander into its trap. Ren stood up, his boots heavy on the iron sand. He looked at the vast, shimmering horizon of the waste. How many others? How many planes lost to turbulence? How many hikers succumbed to the heat? The desert was a graveyard, not because it was harsh, but because it was hunting. He didn't put the compass back in his pocket. He walked to the center of the copper disc, the metal now cooling under the relentless sun. He placed the broken instrument directly on the seam of the seal.
It sat there, a twisted piece of metal on a pristine surface. A headstone for the man fused to the wall below, and a warning marker for the next traveler who trusted a needle more than their gut. Ren turned his back on the well and walked toward the perimeter. He didn't look back until he crossed the invisible line where the wind began to blow again. The sound of the breeze was sudden and violent, rushing into his ears like a gasp for air. Far behind him, the copper eye stared blindly at the sun, silent and waiting. The desert keeps its secrets, but some are just waiting to be fed. If you want to see what other monsters are buried beneath the map, subscribe.